Welcome to American Zarathustra. This is Imperium Art episode 42. In the Imperium Art project, we're not only documenting the arts, but helping to build connections between creators and philosophers in our sphere. Central to that are the publishers, who provide platforms for critical thinking and analysis of all things cultural, historical, and political. As the White Art Collective continues to grow, and we have entered a new phase of Clown World, it's critical to bring these two spheres together so artists can be well informed and reflect on the key ideas relevant to understanding our heritage, our identity, and preserving Western civilization. In today's show, we're going to be talking with the publisher of Imperium Press, who has put out Josh Neal's recent and acclaimed book, American Extremism. At his site, book categories include Western canon, traditionalist histories, studies in reaction, and cultural curricula. And we also found out that our guest is a great musical composer, so we're very excited to talk about that as well. It's my pleasure to introduce the editor and chief of Imperium Press, Mike. How are you, Mike?
I'm good, Donald, and thanks for having me on, fellas.
Okay, so we're also happy to welcome back a friend of the show and a vlogger I really enjoy and admire, Joel Davis. How are you, sir?
Yeah, not bad, man.
Good. Welcome back. So let's welcome back my co-host and friend, the host of White Art Collective's Poetry Cast, Conversations with the Wind, and the Pride of Nullus. How are you?
Hello, Donald. Hello, Mike. Hello, Joel. And hello to the audience. It was long overdue to have Imperium Press on Imperium Art.
Beautifully said. Beautifully said. Before we start, I just want to read the mission statement at their site. It says, works in the history of right-wing thought are rarely ever available in editions that place them where they belong, outside of the liberal worldview. Imperium Press's mission is to rectify this sorry situation. Hey, Mike, so maybe you can start off from that jump-off point there.
Yeah, so this kind of goes into uh, why the company was founded in the first place. So for anyone who hasn't heard of us, we're a dissident right-wing publisher that was founded a couple of years ago and have put out a few books since then, a few that have done quite well and penetrated into the dissident right sphere, and a few that are very well known, in the Western canon. It started off with the Iliad, and that was the first book that we put out, and moved on to a few original works by contemporary authors. But as far as framing things by placing them outside of the liberal worldview, the idea for the publishing company actually kind of came to me because I had read so many of these editions by like Penguin Classics, or actually Penguin Classics isn't too bad, but they are obviously still going to frame things in a liberal way.
Right.
But I found that a lot of the excuse me, and the like Oxbridge University Press editions of these books, these were the ones that are sort of the problem, and that's the issue with that being that they sort of have, because they're Oxford and Cambridge and Princeton and Harvard University Press, they have this cachet of being like, this is the definitive edition. If you are going to understand this, you have to read this one.
I see.
But they're framed in like the worst ways in general. So it was just something where I had read a few books. The one that sort of tipped me off originally, I think, was actually Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil, where I read it. And, I'd read this book before, but I wanted to get just a different edition. I think my old one had become kind of dog-eared and needed to be replaced. So I just got this, and I read the intro to it, and I was like, this guy hates Nietzsche. Like, why is he even, what business does he have introducing him? Like,
Exactly.
He really doesn't like the guy,
Exactly. Yeah.
And I was just like, okay, that's weird when I read the text, and, it's a decent enough edition beyond that, and whatever. And then I read a few more in the same, I think it was actually the Cambridge University edition. What is it? I've got one here on my desk. Text in the History of Political Thought. That's it. and I read a few of them, and it was just like some of them are okay, some of them are really bad for this. Like, and the more illiberal they get, the worse they get. So I just thought, like, well, is there anybody out there that's not doing this, that's doing like justice to these texts and is framing them in ways that are sympathetic to their own aims? And long story short, there was nobody out there doing it. So I thought, okay, well, these texts are available online. How hard can it be to just sort of slap them together, put them into book form?
Yeah.
And fast forward years later, and I'm spending a huge amount of time formatting the next book, because there's a lot that actually goes into the technical process of it, and to edit them down and make sure everything's right, and like find people to contribute, and write up things like indexes and biography or bibliographies and everything. So we really tried to do justice to these texts, and to make them so that they are effectively could be used in an academic setting for teaching. We've got all of, like, everything is put into these editions, so we try to do justice to it. But yeah, that's sort of the genesis of it, was just being dissatisfied with the way that they're framed, and also because I was sort of at the same time I was reading a lot of neo-reactionary thought, and just asking for like reading lists and like begging people, like one of the authors that we ended up publishing, Chris Bond, back when he was blogging as Reactionary Future, I was just like pestering him all the time for reading lists, because clearly the guy, like, he's an excellent reader, which is a sort of a skill in itself, like finding texts and like knowing how to sort of chase down ideas and like seeing where they lead to other people and everything. So I was like begging him for reading lists, and he didn't really offer much. I think it was because he was planning to write the book that he ended up writing, which has a complete bibliography. And I was just sort of like having to find all this stuff myself, and like discovering new worlds of like dissident literature and old books and everything like that. So, and a few other things kind of also led me in the same direction. It was kind of a synchronicity or serendipity that kind of led me to start it, and I'm very pleased with how it's done, actually.
Nice. Or karma, that's what I was saying.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask Joel, how did you connect with Mike, and what's the nature of your relationship with the publishing with Imperium Press and Imperium Cast?
Well, Mike published, he just mentioned Chris Bond. I mean, Mike published his book when he ultimately wrote it. And he also published Anthropomorphics by Adam Katz. So, I mean, these are two individuals that I've been associated with for many years. So going back to kind of when I kind of began in the scene, it was through becoming aware of their blogs, like Adam and Chris's blog, before they even began writing those books. So naturally, when there was, essentially a publisher that popped up and started publishing my friend's books,
Cool.
we started talking, and we, within our kind of community or whatever, like we kind of became connected, and then we did things together, like podcasts and stuff. And now it's kind of formalized into the Imperium Cast, which is, our collaboration, which you can listen to at imperiumpress.org/Imperium Cast, or on my YouTube channel. But like, plugging aside, also just Mike and I guess become friends, and with what I want to do with my journal, the Firstness Journal, which you can read at firstus.org, the first issue. I want to kind of take that into a hard copy version as well. So that's something that Mike and I can collaborate on, and obviously Mike and I share an interest ultimately in, because as Mike said, I mean, I think originally he kind of set out to kind of publish classic texts that had been forgotten, or they had shitty editions where they were warped by modern or contemporary moral standards, and then he ended up just getting thrown all of these new books and publishing new books. And it seems as though like at least half of the Imperium Press, like what it's going to be about, is going to be about publishing stuff from our scene today. I know he has other, but I'm not going to talk about what they are until leave that to Mike. But I know he's got other stuff in the works as well by other contemporary writers from the scene. So, personally, I mean, I think it's going to take me maybe a year or two before I get my shit together with writing a book myself. But obviously, I'd want to publish with Mike. But I'm interested in just being part of this intellectual scene and bringing together, all the different minds in our movement and trying to organize them and provide ways, not just in terms of writing books, but also writing essays in my journal and so forth, to kind of move the conversation forward in terms of intellectual development. So, I mean, Mike and I's collaboration, I think, is one of the key relationships in trying to cultivate that scene. Because in history, every great intellectual movement is always a scene. Usually it's geospecific. It'll be based in a particular university, a bunch of guys that attended the same lectures,
right.
And we're trying to reproduce that online, and it requires a little bit of organization, and it doesn't just kind of spontaneously happen because you'll shit post on Twitter together or something. Yeah.
That kind of leads into my next question: is what's the purpose of the Imperium Cast? And if you have specific goals in mind, or some highlights from the Imperium Cast that you want to talk about, and that's for both of you.
Well, I mean, for me personally, the reason why I wanted to launch the podcast was a couple of reasons. One was because I wanted to throw my weight behind Imperium Press and what Mike's doing, because naturally, if we're creating an intellectual movement, like having a good relationship with the publisher is vital. So I wanted it to be a place where all of Imperium Press's projects could be promoted.
Nice.
And where we could, but also Mike and I had done a few podcast type things together in the past on my channel and on Tyler Hamilton's channel back when we were doing EBL. And, Mike, I don't think he'd really done much of that kind of stuff when, like, the first time he and I did something together. But then after that, he got a taste for it, and he started doing lots of podcasts all over the Discern Right with all different kinds of people.
Nice.
And so it was kind of clear he had a kind of talent for it. And so it was like, well, we should do something together more as a more kind of continuous, permanent thing, as a way to kind of organize the discourse in our sphere, kind of around some kind of continuous piece of content people can listen to, rather than having this kind of loose spattering. It just seemed to make sense, really. So
wonderful. I was actually just listening to Mike on Dave Martell's show. Dave Martell was also a guest on our show a couple episodes ago, and I was really excited about this concept of Proto-European Reconstructionism. That could be a topic as well that maybe Mike would want to touch on. It seems like one of many topics that you guys are interested in. Mike, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, actually, Joel and I did the episode before we did the first Imperium Cast was this was a topic that we touched on. Proto-Indo-European Reconstruction. It's kind of hard to remember how I came to it in a way, because it's been so impactful for me. But it's really down to this one book that I read. I mean, I'd always been interested in this subject, or like in who the Proto-Indo-Europeans were, because they're also, of course, known as the Aryans. This is an important sort of like this is an important word in our circles. It's got something to do with our identity, and the sort of deep history of who we are and who we've always been back to like prehistoric times. So it seems like a kind of weighty subject that I've always wanted to examine. But I tried to sort of like engage with like some people like who knew about the topic, and from an anthropological level and a linguistic level. And just being like, so what's the book that I read on like to understand who these people were? And they're just like, like you kind of, it's like you kind of have to work your way up to it, because you have to understand something about who all the branches were that came from these people. And of course, for anyone who doesn't know, they're the common ancestor of the people who became the Indians and the Iranians and the Romans and Norse and like all the European peoples.
I have a chart somewhere that it does all the kind of the DNA back to them. I'll have to find that and hand that to you or something. But I quickly wanted to give the mic to Nullus, because I think he has a good bit of knowledge about Proto-Europeans, or if you just wanted to jump in at all, Nullus.
Yeah, I mean, I just, first of all, I wanted to comment that, I'm sort of an amateur history buff, and really have a difficulty with contemporary history books, because many of them, they're written utilizing secondary sources. Many times they only use anecdotal reference to primary sources, and so you wind up in this kind of incestuous loop of academics that are basically using each other's material. And then in addition to that, most post-World War II books published on history are highly biased. And this is regardless of the era in question. And now it's reached levels of absolute absurdity in terms of what they're concluding. So when you're reading about the Middle Ages, or you read about the Renaissance, or you read about any particular era, it's so skewed that you really have to understand that part of history. You have to have other sources available to you, and usually those sources are either foreign language sources, in all prior to the Second World War, and all of those have to be and English sources as well. But the less you know, the more difficult it gets for you to navigate through all of this stuff. And so I'm very pleased to hear that that there's an effort that's trying to sift through all of this, because it is very complicated, especially for someone who's not that well versed in history, so doesn't understand these connections and doesn't understand that there's something missing here if they read it, or they don't look at it as critically as they should. So I think that this is an important service and an important project that you're offering with with every both of you actually are providing. So this is something I just wanted to comment on. As far as the history is concerned, that's a very often a very controversial topic, especially when you're talking about areas where the primary sources are very limited. You have difficulty finding those sources, and then you have to go to archaeological sources, anthropological sources. Now, I think what's very interesting are these archaeogenetic sources that are it's still in its infancy, but you're going to have more and more information as it relates to who the Europeans are, where they come from, which group of Europeans, the DNA of, the Nordics are different than the Mediterranean, and, the Slavic and the Eurasian, so all these different groups have a different story. And so then the next question is, what's the connection between all of these different groups, and so on and so forth. So it's really a fantastic and exciting thing, but it's still very new. So when we're talking about that era, it's very difficult to find information, even if you were an academic working on it, I think. And I think that there's a lot of speculation going on right now. The linguists try to dominate this field quite a bit, and I think incorrectly. I think the linguists try to use language, which is a component. It's an important component of it, but it doesn't tell the complete story either. So it's going to be an interesting thing. I really don't have enough information, sadly, and I'm looking at it too, and I'm trying to figure out as well. So the more information you get, the more information I get. I'm more than happy to provide it, but that's really what's happening at the moment. I hope that made sense.
Yeah. So, Mike,
Yeah, it did.
have you made any progress with this study, or can you give us an overview?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, just to sort of touch on a few things that Nullus said. I mean, there was a lot of good stuff to talk about there. The Proto-Indo-European reconstruction, or anthropology, as a discipline, is still fairly new. It only arose in the late 18th century, and it really got going about 50 years later, in the mid-19th century or so. And it's continued since then, and obviously World War II changed a lot in terms of how everything gets framed sort of like religiously in the Western world. But it's still a fairly new topic. So a lot of what I'm doing with trying to figure out like how these people actually lived and what their practices were is reading things like PhD dissertations rather than books. So that is just to say that a lot of this stuff is like not really available. Like you have to really dig for it. There's a few books out there that you can read. There's a book by I forget what the David A. Anthony or something, and it's called The Horse, the Wheel, and Language, and that's a pretty popular one, but it's very heavy on the archaeology, which is great, but it's just not to everyone's taste. There's a few other books as well, but there's not really anything too accessible to read on this. And the thing is, like, you have to be very, very wary of scholarship that's happened since generally about like the 1930s and 40s. But and that excludes quite a lot because, you know, and there's been quite a lot that's been important since then, but obviously we've undergone this sort of like epical ideological shift since then, and a lot of things are just framed in ways that are just trying to like lead you to a certain conclusion and away from other conclusions that don't have anything to do with the truth or the subject matter or anything. So I also I try to read a lot of the 19th century scholarship, which is just absolutely humbling, the sort of erudition that these people have. The one book that we've published that concerns Indo-European reconstruction the most is a book called The Ancient City, which is a very, very influential text on me personally. And what it is ostensibly it's a sort of explanation of how the classical world came to an end and how it sort of wound down and underwent its revolutions and everything. And the TLDR there is that it's actually the Indo-European religion of ancestor worship and the cult of ancestors and the hearth that sort of was the driving factor on everything. And this guy, the author named, he's got like a super long name, but the surname is Coulanges, Coulanges. He is just unbelievably erudite. Like he has clearly read the entire corpus of classical literature in its original Greek and Latin, and he does comparative linguistic work and comparative legal work and all kinds of comparative work, because the comparative method is how we even know these people exist, by comparing the practices of their descendants. And he's done a lot of comparative work and basically sort of worked out the idea that the common theological substratum that ties all these things together is essentially the religion of the family, the particular family lineage. So what these people would do is effectively worship their paternal line, worship the ancestors that were buried in a tomb on the property. And the tomb was sort of like the sacred center of the family, where they would like go and offer like oblations and pour out libations to the ancestors on a regular basis. These were effectively their tutelary spirits, so they're protecting spirits, the land spirits. And what this does is to effectively establish a kind of corporate identity of the family that extends through time, so where there really isn't a sort of time at all, because there's no effective space between you and your great 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 grandfather. And this sort of ramifies through the ages, and it starts with the primitive family that's all gathered around the tomb and the hearth, which is another sort of expression of this corporate identity. And it just kind of like expands over time to where you get the primitive family that's expanded into a clan, which is a grouping of families that all worship their own ancestors and, of course, trace their lineage back to a common ancestor. That's the clan. And then you get this, other sort of convolution beyond that, where you get these clans that all worship the same common ancestor back. And that becomes a tribe, and then you get these confederation of tribes as time goes on, and that becomes the city. And this is effectively where this is sort of the last evolution in the classical age. Is the city is sort of the furthest that it went, the city state, and the city state was still effectively a big ethno state. It was a big family with blood ties of kinship that had the corporate sort of constitutive principle was the religion, which is the state cult. And this bound the city-state to all the members of the city-state to each other in a way that was just totally unbreakable. Well, and not totally unbreakable, because it did eventually decline for reasons that are actually quite similar to what's sort of unraveling our world today. But it certainly made it into a very, very strong structure that was durable and able to sort of work at like levels of scale from the local all the way up to, well, the Roman Empire, this like world-girdling empire. So to see something like that sort of principle, or that organizational structure that can function so well. And of course, the Indo-Europeans themselves, 2 in 5 people alive today speak a dialect of that language. So you got to think that these people had something going for them. It just seemed to me that this would be something to look into, and that's obviously these people were virtuous and that they had something to offer. So that was kind of the genesis of what led me to research into the reconstruction of how these people lived and what they thought and what they believed.
That's
If
incredible.
I could just throw just something in for the audience's sake. The word, the etymology of the word genetics comes from the Latin word gens, or gens, which is essentially, the group of people who are related through their male ancestors. Is exactly
That's the clan.
That is exactly so when we're speaking of genetics, we're talking about family. And that's really what the etymology of the word is. And so that's how we should understand ourselves also, that in that context, as family.
It brings a broader definition to the concept of family as well. So as we're learning more about Mike here, this is a question we ask everybody on our show. So I wanted to ask you to go back even further. How did you come to your racial awakening? Like what happened in your life that made you realize that this is the sphere that you want to be in?
Well, in a way, it was kind of late, but in a way, it kind of wasn't also. Like, if anyone was to ever find my my Reddit posting history, they would actually see not that long ago, like, only a matter of years ago, kind of this libertarian that was kind of like, well, we shouldn't be like explicitly like, making like racist comments and things like that, or being like, and I still don't think we should like be explicitly doing that, but like that sort of leaning away from the edgier like third position kind of things, like just because like for practical reasons, really. So in a way, like my awakening was kind of recent, but in a way it really, really wasn't. In a way, it sort of goes all the way back to like childhood for me. I lived in a city in Canada, like one of the major cities in Canada, which has a very, very distinct sort of like arrangement of ethnic enclaves. Like, here's the part of the city that is Chinese, here's the part of the city that's European, here's the part of the city that's like South Asian, and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
And it was weird because I grew up in a town where, it was like 95+% white or something like that.
Yeah.
So it was a shock to me, moving to this place and just being like, well, what the hell? Like, this isn't what I signed up for in terms of multiculturalism at all. This is just balkanization. And I actually moved into a neighborhood at first when I lived in this city where it was like, I was like the only white guy like walking down the street. And it was really strange because, my one of my kids was going to school, and he was going to school with he was like the only white kid there kind of thing, almost. And I remember going to pick him up at school and like couldn't speak to anybody, none of the parents, right? And we would just be like waiting outside the classroom. And there was this one like wonderful Indian guy, wonderful like Sikh man who would like stand there, and he was like clearly someone's grandpa, like really old and whatever. And we would have these conversations where he would speak Punjabi for a minute, and I would speak English for a minute, and who knows what he was saying. He had no idea what I was saying, but he at least made the effort to sort of reach out, and he saw that I was the only one there and nobody was talking to me. So that was really nice, but it sort of underscored for me the fact that that we do naturally balkanize into these communities, and this is just how it is, and there's just no other way that it can be. And then sort of like going back a little bit further for me, well, quite a bit further. When I was a child, my parents, like my family, lived overseas in a Muslim country, a closed country, like somewhere that you can't even visit, much less like live. And I just remember, like, I loved it there. I loved it, and like when we left, I desperately wanted to go back.
Wow.
And like we went traveling after that. My parents sort of took me around the world a bit, and I was very fortunate in this way. And I got to see quite a few different cultures. I got to see, Middle Eastern cultures and many European cultures and some like Southeast Asian cultures and everything. I was just taken by it. I just loved it. I love the difference and the fact that there was like people who had different food and different architecture and different like songs and customs and dress and all this, like, it sounds really silly for us to say, but like I just love the diversity of it. Like it was just amazing.
I lived in Asia for 5 years and I've traveled all over. But yeah, I feel that. And that's okay. But the beauty of it is that everyone has a place.
Exactly.
Not that they should be mishmashed together, especially in our countries. But I don't mean to cut you off. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. I was just thinking, like, at the time as a child, that like this was just all sort of this whirlwind of colors and interesting things, and then I got a little bit older and started to like get an idea of what the the ideology is that drives the West, and to think to myself like, well, it would be terrible to lose all that stuff now, wouldn't it? Just to have it become this soup that's indistinct, like you say, mush that you just can't, like, once that goes away, it can never come back, sort of thing. It would take, I mean, you can try to reconstruct it as we're doing with the Indo-European reconstruction, but it's a hard road. So it would be wonderful to not lose that. And I guess like the other formative moment that I guess probably it turned me in another direction when I was quite young was I took a history class, and I had a teacher. He's still my favorite teacher of all time in school. I took this history class in grade 9, and it was 20th century history, and you can imagine what we focused on there. And this was what the entire course was all year. And I remember at some stage, just being like, just this jerky teenager or whatever, just kind of like laughing about something, or like making fun of something of what, like, and I can't even remember what it was, but something of what we were talking about, I just made a joke about. And this teacher, who is this like brilliant man, this like amazing, like, the way he would just draw connections between different things and his passion for the subject of history, it just struck me. And I was just like, he was just amazing. And like I say, still my favorite teacher. But I remember after I made this joke, he sort of pulled me aside and all but like rapped me over the knuckles for it. And he was like, "We do not joke about this." And I was just like, "Whoa, man! Like, what?" Like, I was just a teenager, didn't really kind of understand the like wider import of this, and it gave me this impression that like this might be something, like there might be something cultic going on here. And I say that with the full sort of knowledge that like that has like bad connotations, which is unfortunate, because I think the word cult is applies to something in ancient times that was actually quite positive. But anyway, like it made me sort of realize that there's something that you're not allowed to talk about or question here, and that this was weird. Like it was one of those sort of like a glitch in the matrix that just made me go, "Oh, all right," and then just kind of started thinking about things more skeptically in terms of like our received wisdom. And all this stuff many years later just sort of culminated through many threads to bring me over to like a third position or dissident right view from libertarianism. So I think a lot of people have found a similar pipeline from that to one stage to another.
Fascinating. So in a way, you have to thank that professor for sort of, giving you that experience, let's say. So let me move on with the questions, and I'm actually going to hand this over to Joel first and then to Mike. So what is or should be the role of the creator / artist in white identity politics? You want to try that, Joel?
Yeah. Well, I don't don't have a problem with racism. Like, I think racism is based or whatever, but the idea, I think we spoke about this last time I did this podcast. I don't think we should look at a white identity as like our primary focus.
Okay.
And let me kind of explain that, because I think like we're kind of forced into making this identification by circumstances and by kind of what we're confronting, because it's Mike and I's scene, I guess, but also like broadly the dissident right scene, it's become very popular to kind of group everything we don't like under this term liberal or liberalism.
Yeah.
And then, we stand outside liberalism, and like that's our kind of friend enemy distinction or whatever. But I think, lately I've been reading the work of this obscure contemporary Greek philosopher Nullus, where he draws a distinction between what he calls oligarchic liberalism, which is like original liberalism, like the liberalism of John Locke or Thomas Jefferson, or like the French Revolution, or the 19th century in general, and what he calls mass democratic ideology, which is a more contemporary innovation that comes with like the progressive movement, and like just various kind of bureaucratization, expansions of the state bureaucracy in the early 20th century across the West. And he draws this distinction, and it's not as though like these things are totally like mass democracy comes in and liberalism goes out. Obviously, it's more subtle than this, but he draws a distinction, I think, for good reason, because Mike, you guys were talking before, not just Mike, but all of you were talking about the importance of family, and you were just talking before about going to like a foreign country and like everybody knowing their place, and there being a kind of continuity, a kind of embeddedness in the tradition that we just don't have. And so like that's what the original wave of liberalism kind of was. It was by kind of recasting the entire social body in terms of individualism, as though we can have these like contracting individuals that are endowed with all of these utilitarian characteristics through rational self-interest. I can like make my own personal determination of everything, and we can kind of compose society out of like an assemblage of these like out of this social atomism. We can compose society out of their agreements and like negotiations or whatever. That's not actually how it was like in the 18th and 19th centuries. I mean, they still had like everyone was still Christian, everyone was still white, everyone was still in these like familial bonds. It's not like all this stuff just became liquidated overnight because we overthrew a few governments. And so it was a very slow process by which these things slowly became kind of broken up and liquidated. And it took hundreds of years, really. And so during this earlier phase of liberalism, and I guess you could say capitalism, if you want to use that term as well, you still kind of had an aristocracy. You still had a lot of tradition and like normativity and so forth. And maybe you had these cosmopolitan fringes where there was experimentation, but the average normal person from then up until the 20th, like the early part, maybe even the middle of the 20th century was kind of knew who they were. Like if you look in, I know from looking into like Australian politics prior to World War II, like the left wing in Australia in the 1930s would be considered far right by today's standards. And they just made the assumption that everyone's a Christian and everyone's white, like as like the base assumption of like what it means to be in a society before they start bickering over, well, what kind of tax policy are we going to have or something. And so that's like really what liberalism was. It was like taking for granted all of these Western cultural norms, as though we don't even need to even worry about politically institutionalizing them because they're just given. They just are what they are. And what mass democratic ideology is then in the 20th century onwards, and it comes along with the emergence of like sociology as the kind of central discipline of the social sciences, and you could say postmodernism, you could say progressivism, all these different 20th century movements, is the total emptying out of the individual. The idea that like to think of society, no individual can ultimately have substance, or that is given to them by any kind of prior conditions. They're just these kind of empty these empty kind of voids, essentially, these like forms without content that can be repurposed to any kind of social function. And this is the kind of the mentality of the engineer, like the human beings become like raw materials that they can like plug together like Lego into like whatever specific kind of organization that they want. And this is kind of what's presupposed by the notion of mass democracy itself, because you've got to also remember with democracy that the early part of liberalism, again, it wouldn't have been considered democratic by today's standards because, you could only vote if you owned property.
Yeah.
And the only reason property owning males could vote was because they could also purchase guns and organize into militias and overthrow governments based on the technology of the day.
Yeah.
Whereas like by the time you get to the 20th century, all of that's totally irrelevant. Like, it's not like we could form a militia and overthrow the government in the same way, because now the government has drones and nuclear weapons and like, air forces and navies that are like hyper technologically complicated with like, nuclear submarines and shit. Right. I mean, we're flying into space. We've got space stations with like, it's like a totally different paradigm.
Yeah.
And so democracy no longer means what it used to mean. It used to be like counting heads to make sure that, rather than like every time we get pissed off, we're going to overthrow the government, let's like count heads and see who has the most men on their side and like let them run society for the next 4 or 5 years until we do another head count. Mm-hmm. That was what democracy was. And now it became this totally abstracted notion that every individual has this kind of determinative value that's fundamentally equal, that my vote, your vote, some random Somali refugee's vote, it's all equivalent. Like, there's no substantive difference between my determination, your determination, or his determination. And so if we assume this, we have to kind of empty out the individual of having any kind of substance, because if he has any substance, so if we go like, and the logical end is like this woke ideology where if you see like, well, how come there's all these white people that are kind of corporate executives and like succeeding in all of these like competitive domains, and there's no black people being represented in the same quantities? It must be because of racism, and that's based on the assumption that we can't assume that there's any substantive difference between the two groups, because if we did, we'd have to basically undermine mass democratic ideology itself, because we'd have to say, well, there is substantive differences between people that exist independently of their social function. You can't just put on a dress and become a woman or whatever. Like, you are what you are, and that actually means something. If you affirm this, you ultimately have to, if you follow that line of reasoning, eventually you have to bend democracy itself, and you have to, because it completely undermines the logic. Where like previously democracy had a logic, which was, as I mentioned before, it was based in basically counting heads of militias. Yeah. So this is, I think, more what we're facing. It's not so much the fact that, white identity versus other group identities or whatever. It's the more fundamental reality that in Western culture and Western metaphysics even, we've performed this kind of operation on ourselves, which has been totally emptying us of substance and kind of this process of like kind of contentless atomization, where we've, in order to kind of embrace these new ideologies and kind of rationalize this new world that we live in, and I think this is deeply related as well to the impact of like the technological mindset, where we can no longer appeal to anything. Like, even if you look in, I think neo-reaction ultimately falls victim to this very same thing, where neo-reaction will talk about Christianity in terms of its like the benefits it gives to us, a social order in terms of like evolutionary psychology and Darwinism or something, as opposed to evaluating whether Christianity is true or false, as a theological construct. It becomes just like a function in society. It makes women not be whores. It makes men get married younger, and it makes them have more children. And it means like they, it makes them better at at kind of conducting moral business transactions or something. Yeah. And to me, this is like kind of like a disgusting mindset. But this is the mindset that we've kind of entered into, where everything, like society, is just another like a machine. And you see this in sociology, where now like cybernetics has like entered into sociology, which is cybernetics is systems theory. It was the logic that we used to build computers and robots originally, like originary robotics. now we're kind of looking upon society from the perspective of engineers, and everyone does this. Even people on our side do this, where we have to subordinate everything to this functionalist account of how all the pieces fit together, as opposed to asking, again, like I was saying at the very beginning, we just took all these things as given. Basically, whiteness or whatever. We didn't have to like have an ideology of being pro-white or whatever. It was just given. We kind of intuitively just received it, and it's like that's like the only way in which we're going to reconstruct. Like Mike said, it'd be a shame if we lose this and have to reconstruct it. I think we've already lost it. It's already gone because, like, metaphysically, it's gone. We have to reconstruct it.
I don't mean to cut you.
Yeah.
I want to tie it back into the idea of artists and creators and the arts. That's obviously the theme of it. So
this is where I was going. So I was a bit of a long-winded.
I apologize. Go ahead.
Yeah. So in terms of like how it's reconstructed, I don't think we're going to reconstruct it with a political ideology or some kind of new set of sciences or like a new approach generated out of this discourse, because this discourse is the very discourse that ultimately has liquidated this givenness that I was kind of referencing. And this is where I see the arts as performing their role, and aesthetics in general, and even an expanded definition of aesthetics that transcends the arts in their specificity, is articulating this givenness. So like, imagine like, if you walk into a cathedral, go to some Gothic cathedral in like, the middle of Europe somewhere or something, or you kind of see an experience for yourself what it's like to perceive this work of a civilization which had this givenness, which kind of just presupposed without even questioning so many aspects of who it was, and you experience what that looks like. I feel like that can change you a lot more than reading a book about it or providing some kind of analytic framework for contextualizing it. And I think this is ultimately what we need going forward. Is we need to be able to create like, cinematic and literary constructions that depict a world in the future in which we have this givenness. So we need to produce various depictions of what it means to actually be who we are, that we can kind of performatively embrace. So this is kind of like a kind of poetic interpretation or an aesthetic interpretation of who we are, because ultimately that's, for something to be given to you, that's the only way you could have received it. You kind of feel it, and you're immersed in it, as opposed to intellectually kind of comprehending it. And I think that's why the arts have a kind of fundamental role that needs to be prior to like philosophy or intellectualization, because then if we kind of everything has to be intellectualized, we're just going to end up reproducing the very thing that has got us to this point, I think, in Western history, which is subordinating everything to this like this kind of technological model that empties everything out of any kind of givenness. So anyway, with that, I'll throw it back to you.
It feels like that's the ideal of the Imperium. It is, at least to me, and that's something I strive for in my own, quote, Imperium art. I do all kinds of art, but I do Imperium art as well, and that's something I'm working on to promote with others as well, and get that on the radar with the White Art Collective, etc. Let me hand the question over to Mike. Now, Mike is a musician. We discussed a little earlier about his music not being necessarily political, but let's say from a musician's perspective, what kind of music might you create that could sort of answer this question of givenness, of making a future world vision where we are who we are?
Well, I guess like ultimately, and I hope this doesn't sound like a cop-out, it just has to be good music, like it just has to be something that people find attractive. Like, sort of as an analogy, I find that the best way to red pill people, the best way to like really get them on board with like what it is that we're about, is not to sort of hand them a like a red pill, or to like give them a crime statistics, or even like a really well thought out argument. It's just to be cool, and then like have people like you, and then just announce that you're not apologizing for being who you are, right? Like,
Yeah.
I just find that like the best way to sort of get people to believe what we believe and value what we value is just to be an attractive personality, and also believe what we believe, right? Like, I think that's the way that it works for everybody. It's like you sort of point to a person or a situation that's something that like we can all agree is cool, and you just say like, well, what would that person do, or how would that situation sort of like come to pass for us, right? Like, so you just basically, and it sounds kind of like a cop out. It's like all you have to do is just be talented. Well, that's what you have to do, right? Like, what's going to sort of win hearts and minds is creating amazing art, and it doesn't necessarily have to be political, like per se, right? Like, someone like, for example, J.R.R. Tolkien. Now, there's an example of an artist who, although there are certainly like political undercurrents in the Lord of the Rings and everything like that.
Right.
It's not political. It's just amazing, right? And I can think of very, very few figures in the 20th century who have been more influential in leading people to us than him. And it's because of what he did, right? So basically what we have to do in order to, and again, like, I think Joel's point here is a little bit more profound than the point I'm trying to make, because what he's saying is like ultimately to think of art in terms of utilitarian ends is to have already lost the battle. And I think that is ultimately the way that we need to look at it, but I'm not going to repeat his point. If we are going to look at it in terms of utilitarian considerations, what we have to do is that we have to kind of establish a cultural and creative space that people can inhabit, and particularly that elites can inhabit. Now, it's not like I don't think that like creating art specifically like for elites is really what we want to do.
Right.
But this means that everything from like folk art to high art is something that like we'll have to get involved in, and that's something that we already are. So I'm sure that like, and what I mean by inhabiting a creative space, I'm sure that like everybody here has found something like a piece of art or a poem or some music or whatever that wasn't just like pleasant or nice to hear or like whatever, but actually like gave you strength and empowered you. That's what I'm talking about.
I think publishers can provide that in a way as well, right?
I think so too. Ultimately, though, it's the writers that are doing it, and I think the publishers. What our role is to act as selection mechanisms to sort of curate things in such a way that we're bringing the best and we're bringing the right things to people. But it really ultimately starts with the artist. Like, we're sort of middlemen, but important middlemen, but that's what we are as publishers.
Well,
if I'm being honest.
Oh yeah, it's critical. Let me hand the mic over to Nullus for a moment to respond. Go ahead, Nullus.
Well, first of all, both of you have made excellent points, and I believe that in one of the many episodes that we've had on Imperium Art, we've touched upon various points that both of you have mentioned. So it feels very good to hear it coming from both of you. So it kind of solidifies our position on it as well. Above all, we must strive toward excellence, regardless of what we're doing, whether we're musicians, writers, publishers, painters, you name it. We have to strive toward excellence, because that's the only way we can provide successful material. And we need to also understand, and maybe before I even go there, this kind of circles back to the question we had with John of Lilo and John a while back, Donald.
Yeah.
So maybe as an ancillary question to both Joel and Mike, should Imperium Art be inclusive or exclusive?
It should definitely be exclusive, because inclusivity is gay. first of all, just as a concept. And I think that one of the most important things that we need to do is teach the kids how to not be faggots. I mean, ultimately, we live in a society where the kids are growing up. Every generation is gayer than the last, and they need to be given, I think, aesthetic examples of not just masculinity, but of just like being cool, being based, you know, and that's so important. Like, I don't think this could really be understated. Like what I was saying before about this givenness, our culture already has the capacity within it over, you know, that we already have it directly available to us to represent amazing things. Like the artistic achievements even of the 20th century in the West are incredible. If you kind of group together all of the best achievements and put it under one umbrella, I mean, it could probably stack up. We can talk about degeneracy all we like, but you could probably put the 20th century up there with any century in human history as maybe the greatest in terms of the sheer like diversity of artistic achievement. And and even if you don't accept that, I mean, the just in terms of like the intensity of what's possible to depict with, like, I think technologically advanced forms of creation. So like whether you look at music, the role of what technology has done to music, creating all these new instruments that didn't previously exist, or cinema, like these things just simply haven't been possible before, and what's possible to depict now is incredible. So I think there's so much potential right here, right now, in what we have available to us to really create amazing things. And what Mike was saying before, like it matters more that the music's good than that it's political. I mean, this idea that art has to be political, I think, is actually a leftist notion.
Sure.
And they created it. I mean, Walter Benjamin created this notion. I mean, or I don't know if he was like really like the apex of it, but it was like his antidote to fascism, because he said, well, what fascism is this aestheticization of the political. So we need to politicize aesthetics as a left-wing response. And so this I'm more into this aestheticization of the political, which means like making a bunch of cool shit, and then eventually that coolness bleeds into the political. It's more in line with the concept of, if we're a civilization that's pumping out all these amazing creative products, if we have all these crazy new innovations across the board, then it's worth fighting for, because you're like, wow, look at all this amazing shit that we're doing. Like, I really want to fight to preserve this and protect this.
Yeah.
If we're totally stagnant and barely innovating, and we're becoming kind of contemptible, where each, like, as I said before, each generation is gayer than the last, then people aren't going to want to fight for the civilization. People aren't going to care. They're not going to buy into the institutions. They're not going to buy into the direction of society, because it seems to be pointless. I think that's. Go ahead.
Yeah, so you would make it a rite of passage. So someone would have to earn their way into Imperium Art, so to speak.
Well, yeah, I mean, people have to be. You have to be good, and also like everything that's anything is based on exclusion. So like, you know, the most radical individuality is the exclusion of everything else, and every kind of specific movement in history is always kind of grounded in a basically like a very like strong definition of who we are. If you define the more strongly you define who you are, like the more difficult it is for most other people to become members. So like if you look at like the 80s, all the great music was created by subcultures, and those subcultures, you had to pay very high costs in terms of what you could and couldn't be in order to participate in them. Otherwise you were kind of outed as a poser, or outed as like inauthentic. And I think this is the case with the right. We have with the dissident right, like we have incredibly harsh standards, and that's how we are able to maintain our individuality in the face of this kind of diffuse nothing burger that is the rest of the culture at the moment.
Interesting. Mike, did you want to add anything to that? Mike?
Sorry, I started talking there while I was muted.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that the bringing up the distinction between like communism as the politicization of the aesthetic and fascism as the aestheticization of the political, that's an important one, because really brings home the fact that aesthetics is upstream of, well, it's upstream of politics, and because it's upstream because morality is upstream of politics, and aesthetics is upstream of all of that. So basically, aesthetics is sort of like this the river that flows into morality and ultimately into politics. And yeah, I think that this is the way that it needs to be. It needs to be framed, because ultimately, what you do is if you're constructing a sort of worldview or a political movement or whatever it happens to be, is you're pointing at things that are good and you're being like that. This is it's an ostensive gesture. You're just pointing at something that's amazing and being like that's the thing that we are. That's the thing that we need. This is everything that's good and right and true. And aesthetics is sort of like that gesture, that sort of pre-rational gesture towards like what is great. And if your aesthetics are sort of the result of like this syllogistic sort of ratiocinative, if you come to your aesthetics on the basis of reason, then those aesthetics are going to be pretty impoverished. And the fact is that this is what sort of drives everything else in the culture. So your culture is going to be super impoverished too. It really has to start with what's beautiful and what's great, and in a way, what's hygienic, which is another sort of aspect of aesthetics as well. It's like what separates clean from dirty, inside from outside, good from bad. All these dichotomies sort of are based on aesthetic distinctions in the first place.
That's phenomenal. So to go back to the mission of this show here, the next question I have for you both is, what is the synergy, or what should be or could be the synergy between philosophers and artists? When I say philosophers, I mean that as an umbrella term, all the vloggers and thinkers in our sphere. So, both of you being that, Joel specifically is, an amazing example. Tyler Hamilton, Josh Neal, people that produce ideas and perceptions and new ways of putting things together that are really, really critical for, as Joel was saying, pushing the conversation forward. We're trying to connect these ideas with the creators, and I'm creating this whole program mainly for the White Art Collective and then for everybody else, because I feel like our artists have to be armed with ideas. They have to be on the cutting edge. It's important to use their instinct and their intuitions, their guts, so to speak, to create their work, and they have their own stories, etc. But we can't be, in a void either. We have to be plugged into, the cutting edge ideas and stuff. So I wanted to just toss that idea out there. How can we create a more conversation between thinkers and creators? Mike, you want to start?
Sure, yeah. So as far as the question of what is the relationship between the political order and the aesthetic order, shall we say, there's a bit of a symbiotic relationship. I know I just got done saying that the aesthetic is upstream of all of it, but in meat space, in the concrete world, there is a sort of give and take. There's a relationship between the two, where the two actually work in tandem, and I think that you kind of see this a lot more with like more corporatist type societies. That is something more like a feudal social order, where you get these like guilds for artists and guilds for all kinds of creators. That these things work together. Like you could see in something like the medieval cathedrals that Joel was just talking about a little bit earlier. These are like multi-generational art projects,
right,
where there's a total society, a totalized society is what produces those. And ultimately, this is something that's what needs to be striven for. This is what we want. Like you look at like ancient Egypt and the art that came out of the phenomenal art that came out of there, the phenomenal architecture. It was all part of a sort of unified culture. These things need to work in tandem. And I think a good example of that would be something like the warrior culture of various cultures throughout time. You could take, for example, something like feudal Japan or Homeric Greece or the Norse or any other culture where sort of the martial spirit rules, which is something that we need to get back to, in my opinion. And look at what the role of the bard was in those cultures. So take Homeric Greece, for example. Homer is kind of something where we don't really have a cultural analog for this anymore, and that's like much to our detriment, really. What Homer is, for the archaic Greek, is something like the Bible and NFL and MMA and the Metro Opera, like all rolled up into one thing. There's nothing like it today. And the artist, and especially like the warrior poet, which is something I know that Nullus has talked about on his conversations with the wind. The warrior poet is sort of the main dispenser of what the Greeks called kleos aptiton, which is undying fame, right? Like there's a line from Horace, one of the Roman poets. I think I can sort of remember it verbatim here. It's something like, many heroes there were before Agamemnon, but these heroes are lost in unending night because they lacked a bard, right? Like in a healthy society, in a culture like, the Greek and Roman cultures sort of before the classical age, in a healthy society, which is just to say like an honor culture where the locus of moral order is external to individual conscience, honor and shame do it all. They count for everything. And the bard is the one that confers that on them, ultimately. Well, ultimately, it's the culture at large, but the bard is sort of the tool by which that is achieved. And so the bard is really king in these societies.
Wow.
And that's just as it should be. So, I mean, if we're going to recapture a sort of warrior culture, this kind of like apodictic poetry of celebrating what's great and high and beautiful in our culture, in our history, is going to have to be resurrected. Things like family sagas and like deeds of the ancestors, and seeing oneself as a link in like this unbroken chain that reaches back to time immemorial. If we're being honest, it's going to have to involve things like aestheticized violence as well, because this is an important part of why these societies were able to do what they did. Like if you look at something like Quentin Tarantino, which is certainly no friend to us, watch something like Inglourious Bastards. Obviously that's sort of directed at ideologically in ways that are just totally shitty. But just watch it from a technical standpoint. Watch it from like how it hits you in the gut. And like that film, just by the end of that film, it's like you just want to go out and punch somebody. Not out of frustration, but because it just gets you so riled up. And this is kind of what, in a very distorted and sort of degenerated and crippled way, this is what Homer did for the ancient Greek. That's what we need. We need something like that. That's the kind of that is what the artist can do for us as a people. And we're pretty far away from that right now, but it would not be a stretch to say that we could get back there. But what it requires it requires artistic mastery. And this is why I'm saying like it matters so much more that you're a good artist than that you're a political artist.
I'm going to turn it over to Nullus for a quick response, but I wanted to pop in here. I have a song called Thought Police that is an anthem that I wrote for our people. I wrote it back actually in the days of, I don't know, it's maybe 2017. There were a lot of riots going on, and I thought I would like to write a song for our guys going into these riots. And I think it's going to become a timeless piece in that regard. If anyone wants to look that up, look Thought Police here on American Zarathustra. So it just fits right into what you were just saying with that, like, I guess I'll just leave it at that and hand it over to Nullus. Go ahead.
So that is exactly, that hits the nail on the head in my opinion as well. And I wrote about this in my essay on Imperium Art, where I believe that we need to first have sort of a cognitive dominance in the culture insurgency, because in my opinion at least, I believe that we've lost the culture war. I think that we're not in a position where we are equal combatants. The adversary is significantly more powerful than we are. So what we have right now is a culture insurgency, and there's nothing wrong with that. But we have to understand our position realistically, because by understanding that realistic position, then we can strategize accordingly. And the cognitive dominance aspect of it, I believe, is extremely important in order for us to understand ourselves and keep our cool as we're doing what we're doing as artists. And this goes in and flows into the dialectics of artistic violence that I write about, that ultimately is symbolized by the warrior poet. And so I'll just read a short passage from my essay. I don't know if you had a chance to read it, Mike, but in this passage I write, Imperium Art represents a synthesis through the concept of the warrior poet, who embraces themes of violence and rage, but tempers the emotion with discipline and a conviction based on a solid moral foundation. The warrior poet represents values and virtues, and does not shy away from explicit expressions of the full emotional spectrum, but tempers it through contemplative intellectual discipline. The warrior poet is not defined along external cultural pressures, but is based on European representations of truth and honor. And I think that this is an important point that we have to, and we're not just talking about poets, we're talking about artists in general, represented through the concept of the warrior poet. I just wanted to mention that. If you had any comments to that, Mike, I'd be very interested.
Yeah, well, I think that the idea of the warrior and the warrior poet sort of being the expression of this in language and in art, but the warrior as someone that's not just a spaz, someone that is inherently controlled, that has their emotions sort of under control, but like in a way that they can allow that to manifest itself and sort of let the dog off the chain when they need to.
Right.
That's really important, right? Because there's a sort of and this is in some ways just a modernity thing. There's a general sort of aesthetic of the tough guy or the person who's physically dominant as just being unhinged and sort of like not in control of their emotions. That is it's really not like it's not the warrior aesthetic. Like you think of something like the feudal Japanese samurai. This was not a guy that would just snap at the at the drop of a hat kind of thing. It's like nor with the the Greek hoplite or the Norse berserker that would have to work himself up into a frenzy. It wasn't like he was just this guy that was always on the edge that would just snap at anything. They would sort of have to work themselves up into this to really do what they did. I think it's important to understand that discipline is just as important as anything else, like as important as your ability to fight. So you have to. It's a battle over your emotions as much as it is a battle over the external enemy, and I think that's sort of what you were driving at there.
Absolutely, that's absolutely correct. And in addition to that, I'd say that we have to be able to fully embrace every aspect of who we are. So we should not shy away, because you hear this often where people try to discourage you from expressing your violent emotions. You have to express it, because if you keep it bottled up, then it will ultimately go somewhere that it shouldn't. It can turn into a poison for you. You have to let it out. And you have to be able to express that through the discipline that we're talking about here. But you have to express it, and you have to do it in a creative way, and you also have to do it in a way where people like what you're doing. I mean, you whether it's a song or a story or a poem, if people don't like it, then you're doing it for yourself, which is fine. But then, we have to really understand what it is that we want to achieve here.
This ties into a discussion that we're having currently in the White Art Collective. Jeff Winston was on Jason Kuna's No White Guilt show yesterday, in fact, and the discussion of optics, love versus violence, and what is the movement about, and all these things. And one thought that comes to mind with me is how angry we are. And Mike was just talking about, the poet warrior being able to kind of control that emotion and let the dog off the chain, as you said, when necessary, etc. And as for the artists, I feel that we are the ones that are expressing and kind of, I don't want to say manifesting, but we're channeling that anger and that frustration over white replacement in our music, gifs, video, art, memes, all this kind of art culture that we have in our sphere. And it bonds us together. There's sort of like, memes that are too dank for, social media, and you can only see it on Telegram or in secret channels and things like that. And I feel like that's the glue that's kind of bringing us together and moralizing us in some ways, even though some of that can be very violent and very racist. You could be kicked off of social media for posting such things, but in a sense, that's part of our art sphere, the art of our world here in the dissident right. So there's a lot of questions. It's something that we're going to have to work through, and again, tying it back to how do thinkers and creators come together? What's the dialogue that we're supposed to have here? And then again, the idea of aesthetics, morality, trumping aesthetics, trumping politics in terms of that, what's downstream from what and how it all ties together. So this, I think, is a critical topic and a really well-informed conversation. So I'm really happy with what we're doing here. But I do want to move on to another question. So how does art function at this stage of civilizational decay? What are the pitfalls, illusions, the traps that artists could fall into? How might artists in our sphere avoid this and produce work that empowers our movement? And I think that's just essentially a continuation of the conversation we're having. But I like, for example, we were talking before about communism politicizes aesthetics, whereas fascism aestheticizes politics. So this is a really interesting sort of dichotomy. And the question, for me as an art teacher, I subscribe to all kinds of art vlogs and channels, etc. And I see 100% of garbage coming out. It's just garbage, garbage, garbage. And I don't know how these galleries make money or pay their rent or et cetera, because it's all about, this Black female artist is talking about racism in her art. And you look at the painting and it's just unbearable to look at. And she's borrowing sort of Western painting techniques and themes, but just, slapping them together in a way that makes no sense. And just because they say that it's doing this, that it's, representing people of color and talking about systemic racism, somehow just saying that makes the art of any kind of value. And, that's obviously not somebody in our sphere, but when artists, are surrounded by that and the art world tells you that's what art is, then that's a horrible trap. That's a terrible hole to dig yourself out of. So I just want to field this question to you guys and see what your thoughts are on that. Joel, would you like to start?
Yeah, I would. I'll segue into answering this question by saying what I wanted to say in response to what Mike said before. He brought up Tarantino's Inglourious Bastards.
Mm-hmm.
And that movie I love purely because it has like epic violence, and then there's like a couple scenes, if I remember correctly, where there'll be like a kill shot or something, or like some dude whacking a dude in the face with a baseball bat, and then he'll show you like two replays from different angles just so you can really appreciate the shot. And I love that about it. But his most recent movie, I think it was his most recent, I haven't seen him do anything else since, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, I thought this was the most reactionary movie that Tarantino ever made. Perhaps he's getting old, and this is why. And that movie, I'm gonna spoiler alert. Like that movie, it has Brad Pitt and Leonardo DiCaprio as the two kind of lead roles, and in many ways, those two actors are probably like the archetypal Hollywood actor of our generation, or like the last 20 years or 20, 30 years. They're like the two household names, the two actors that chicks want to fuck the most, probably in like this whole generation. And I think he picked them intentionally for this movie because what this movie I interpreted it as was Tarantino was expressing a kind of immunological response to woke ideology, right? Where he's depicting the Charlie Manson or the Manson family murders in the late 60s, and the way he depicts the Manson family, he depicts them as just like unhinged hippie nutcases.
Yeah.
But he depicts them as really unhinged nutcases. And there's like this one scene where DiCaprio and Pitt are driving, and like they're driving somewhere, and usually in a movie you would just cut scene from when they left to when they arrived, but for some reason he puts this little scene in the middle where where they pull up at these traffic lights, and then Brad Pitt just looks over at some hippies walking down the side of the road, and he's like, fucking hippies, I fucking hate them. And then it just like switches like to them arriving at the destination. Like, why would you even put that in there? And the whole movie, it just kind of develops like Brad Pitt gets into a series of cool fights where he like wins every time in epic ways. Like he gets into a cool fight with Bruce Lee at one point, just because, which is kind of cool. And then it gets finally to the end of the movie, and it's supposed to be the murder of Sharon Tate, but then the hippies, like it's like an alternative history.
It's sort of a fictional history.
Yeah, where they go to the wrong house, and they have this like epic final battle where like DiCaprio's drunk in the pool and ends up like pulling out some flamethrower to kill him, and then Brad Pitt's like tripping balls on acid with his dog and starts laughing at the guy with the gun in his face and ends up fucking him up with the dog food or whatever. It's a really fucking cool ending. It's one of like, but what it represented to me, because there's these scenes in the movie where, because DiCaprio, his character in that movie is a kind of actor that was like the big hot shot in all of these cowboy movies, and then he's kind of like his career's backsliding and he's failing and he's like trying to deal with this. And Brad Pitt's his stuntman, of course. And it like there's this one scene where there's this like movie buff who's like rich, who's there like I'm a big fan, and he's talking to him. What I love about you is just like watching you punch on a Friday night at home with the missus on the couch, and I'm swinging back a few whiskeys, and you're just fucking up some dude in a cowboy movie. That's why I watch movies. And it's like Tarantino's like, yes, this is what Hollywood is supposed to be about. It's supposed to be about a cool good guy, the cowboy, the American archetype, fucking somebody up. And like that's the whole point. It's just like cool to watch, and the force that's destroying this are the hippies, these psychopathic hippies that are resentful because they're weird freaks. That are essentially trying to kill Sharon Tate, and Sharon Tate is that Australian actress. I can't remember her name, and she doesn't even say anything the whole movie. She just walks around looking hot, and that's all she does. Tarantino's like, that's all that she's supposed to be. She's supposed to be a babe she's just hot, and that's the only function that she serves. You have this whole character development of some masculine, cool hero who's just trying to fuck people up violently for good reasons. They're like the good guy, and then you have and so like it's kind of like resetting what Hollywood is supposed to be about, and like kind of performatively ejecting these psychopathic hippies. And I thought that was brilliant. I thought that movie is incredibly underrated. But moving beyond this to like, how do we defend ourselves? I think that movie provides a kind of archetypal platform for what could be done, where it's like I think performatively, particularly this is true, I think, in the literary and cinematic arts, but it's not just in this. I think this could also be done in music, where you take a paradigm given by contemporary society, and then you inject it with this reactionary kind of immunization that kind of resets it and like reestablishes the values and reestablishes the archetypes as they're supposed to be, and so it can kind of like subvert a subversion and return it to an affirmation of the truth. I think this is a powerful kind of model that could be. You could take this into all kinds of degenerated forms of art and perform this action. It'd be quite interesting to see what you could do. But secondarily, also, I think another thing that artists need to pay attention to, and our movement in general needs to worry about, is the fact that we're this online movement. And obviously not exclusively in an absolute sense, but very much so we are an online movement. And I think this is the biggest problem that we have to face, because to create good art, I think you need to be in physical space with one another. Particularly, this is true in music, I think. This is why our music production has not been, I mean, music is supposed to emerge as like a scene, and it's supposed to emerge in a physical place. Like you're supposed to go to the club, and that's where all that kind of music begins. And like you look at like the history of rock and like alternative rock, all these different genres, industrial music, electronic music. They all emerge in a specific city out of a specific scene of specific people and specific places that all lived together, made music together, partied together every weekend, and they took on, like, they created a subculture that they lived in their everyday life, and those were their girlfriends and boyfriends were from, and those were all their friends were from, and like that was who they were. And I think we need to recreate this. Rather than being this weird online movement, because I think that ultimately we're kind of ceding ground to contemporary society. Then we're kind of allowing, I think, Baudrillard's depiction of hyper-reality, we're kind of allowing hyper-reality to kind of govern the space in which we commune and share our creations, where, his notion of hyper-reality is this idea of signs pointing to other signs in perpetuity, where it never gets back to the referent. And so we're just like this floating orb of representations that point to each other but never actually return to the real. And it's like, this is the internet par excellence. We need to somehow figure out how to get out of the internet back to the real. And I think this is the phase that is necessary, because if we don't achieve this, like, we can create funny memes and we can create cultural tropes, but it's almost like all of the culture that we develop is just this internet thing. It's just this way of signing on the internet rather than this way of being in the world. And I think this is really debilitating. So
I have a huge secret about that I'm just busting at the seams to tell you that we're going to be moving in that direction, but I'm not really at a place where I can divulge that right now. So I'm just giving you a little light at the end of the tunnel regarding that topic about live music. So there's, I don't know, maybe hand it over to Mike, though, and see if Mike wants to respond. So just to reiterate the question, the idea of, the pitfalls and illusions and traps of artists in this era, in this sort of civilizational decay that we're having, how might artists in our sphere avoid this and produce work that empowers our movement?
I think it's important what Joel said there at the end about the fact of being deterritorialized, so that is sort of decoupled from like a time and place. That's really a problem for artists, but it's also a problem for the right wing in general, because we are the side of everything that's organic and embedded and particularized and historicized and everything. So this is something that we really need to be wary of in general, not just in the art world, but also, in terms of building communities. Like, communities are something that has to exist in real life and has to exist in meat space. So one of the interesting things I found, Dave Martell, whom you spoke with a couple of episodes ago, he put out an amazing video recently where he talked about his folk building. So this is like building his tribe, building his like literal clan, his family, out of his religious milieu. And this is something like, he's doing the right thing. This is what people need to do. Like, whether you're Christian or whether you're pagan or whatever you are, it needs to be about like building community in real life and establishing these real kind of connections with other people. So I think that's very important, but I don't want to sort of reiterate Joel's point.
Sure.
I'll take it in a different direction, because I think you asked like how art functions at this stage of the civilizational cycle, and I think it's important to underscore that there is a civilizational cycle.
Yeah.
These things have happened before. I think what you see historically at this kind of stage is you see a bifurcation of artistic sort of streams or channels. On the one side, you see high art becoming ever higher and more remote and more distant from anything that like people really like, to be honest.
Sure.
That's what you're talking about in terms of these galleries that are just like, you know, just exhibiting like woke garbage. And like it's just straight up
Trash.
Politics and nothing to do with art. Sure. And then you, at the other end of this, at the other end of the bifurcation, you see a sort of like re-energizing and regeneration of the sort of folk soil out of which all high art ultimately grows. And I think for us, yes, we need to be involved in high art. Yes, we need to be putting out art that strives upward and to be transcendent and everything. But at the same time, what we're really doing here, if you really take this civilizational cyclicity seriously, is we're planting the seeds for what is going to come. Like exactly. This radical innovation that you see in the art that sort of came out of the 20th century, and I agree with Joel that the 20th century can stack up to any other century in terms of its like artistic mastery. You just have to look for it. But some of the more ultra innovative kind of like channels of art is not really what it's about. Like radical innovation is nice, but it can only kind of go so far before it becomes totally forgotten. Yeah. And to kind of tie it back to like the music, like the stuff that you guys heard of mine, I'll give you an example of a band like Nirvana, which probably came to mind once or twice while you were listening to the stuff I gave you.
Oh yeah.
I think Nirvana is a really good. I love Nirvana. Like I'm sorry, like a lot of people in our circles are going to disagree with that, but I think that they were an amazing band. They were like one of the greats for a reason. There's a reason why Kurt Cobain is really the only artist from the 90s that's remembered. And it's because they paid homage to the kings who went before them. Like Kurt was the only one in the Seattle scene that really cared about the Beatles at all, right? Wow. They paid homage to the like sort of Black Sabbath and and as well as Black Flag, which is the way that they kind of characterize themselves, right? They paid homage to all these kings who went before them, but they did something a little bit different. They didn't just slavishly recreate the same thing. It was a sort of dialectical, marriage or confrontation, maybe is a better way to say it, but between metal and punk and the sort of revolutionary spirit that grew out of the earlier, like in the 60s and whatever. They kind of took that and they synthesized it into something that was more than the sum of its parts. And that's why Nirvana still stands up today. You can still throw on Nevermind, you can still throw on In Utero, crank that shit up to 11, and make sure the neighbors hear it, and it's still good. It's like that because he didn't try to innovate too much, right? Like this is what we need to do. It's a matter of putting your stone on top of this impossibly deep and large cairn that has come before you. There should be some sort of continuity. If you're a poet, say there should be some sort of continuity between you and the Ballad of Sir Patrick Spens or something like this, like these medieval ballads. Like you should be able to draw a line between you and that. And this is what our role is to sort of revitalize the folk spirit. I was talking before about Indo-European reconstruction, and I think it was Nullus who mentioned that. There's a little bit too much of a focus on linguistics, and I agree. Actually, linguistics is something that I've studied for a long time, and to the degree where I decided to take it upon myself to learn a couple of dead languages to actually deal with this stuff and really get into it.
Wow.
But I agree, linguistics only takes you so far. One of the things that we're going to be putting out, Imperium Press is going to be putting out later this year, is a book of folk tales called Folk Tales in the Indo-European Tradition, which basically sets out some of the folk tales and organizes them so that you can categorize according to where they came from and when they came from, which is very, very ancient in a lot of cases. But what I'm sort of driving at here is that you don't just need comparative linguistics to revive the Indo-European spirit. You also need comparative folklore, and this is something that's really, it's almost not even on the map, right? Comparative folklore studies, you could probably collect people who are involved in that into, a room together in the whole world, right? Like there's not much of that going on, but this is something that needs to happen as far as reconstructing Indo-European spirit is concerned. But the folklore aspect of it is really, really important. And for us, like at this stage in the civilizational cycle, where we're probably somewhere like well into the late antiquity stage, maybe into like the migration period, if we're really, if I'm being honest with myself, I think we're way further. We're not just like at the point where we're waiting for Caesar. It's like Caesar's long gone, and like we're way further down the track than that. This is where you see a kind of conscious re-invoking of the folk tradition, and I think that this is something that we need to do. This is one of the things that our art collectives should be doing consciously.
This is exactly the thing I was hoping for in this show, is to get a clear, explicit answer to that question and to help the artists in our sphere. This has been a phenomenal discussion, and actually I'm sure we could go on and on. There's so many topics here. So I usually wrap it up about an hour and a half in. So I just want to ask if anybody has any closing thoughts, and then if you would let people know where they can find you. And so I'll hand it off to Joel.
Well, I think Tyler's name was mentioned a few times in this, and I think Tyler Hamilton's been on this show before. So Mike and I are doing the next Imperium Cast over the next few days, in which Tyler Hamilton is our guest. You'll be able to find that on my YouTube channel, which I trust you'll probably link in the description, or on the Imperium Press website at imperiumpress.org/Imperium Cast. Yeah, Mike, I don't know if you might want to talk about like Imperium Press's future schedule a little bit as well.
Sounds good.
Yeah, so there's quite a lot that's coming for us. In the next year, like we've got a full release schedule worked up for the remainder of the year, and we've got more than the next year's worth of releases for 2021. 2022, and we just have to sort of select what's going to come. But yeah, we've got quite a bit coming. We've got, by the end of the year, we're going to have another original book by a contemporary author. And we're going to keep going with some of the series that we've got, like our Studies in Reaction, which is kind of like short, punchy, digestible works that are fairly compact in the history of in the history of reactionary thought. We've got the Traditionalist Histories. We're going to drop a couple of just standalone works, one by Joseph de Maistre, one by Robert Filmer. So we're going to be paying a bit more homage to our Christian forebears here in the next year. And we're going to continue on with some of the other series, but we've got also some new stuff coming next year. So next year probably we'll drop our syllabus, which is basically a series of curated reading lists. This is, I think, something that unfortunately we don't really have time to talk about, but it's, I think, going to be one of the most important things we ever do, because what it is effectively is it's like a sort of course, it's almost like a course structure for self-education in our, in any topic. It's going to be a bunch of topics. There won't necessarily just be a liberal. We'll be talking about things like, various historical epics, as well as philosophy as well as well, one of them is going to be English poetry, for example, or art and whatnot, like all manner of topics. What it is a series of reading lists that sort of keep you away from some of the like shitty liberal framing that we were talking about at the very beginning. So this is a way to self-educate on any like one of a range of topics in a way that's going to sort of like lead you in the right direction. So I think the syllabus is going to be important. Next year, we're going to drop the first of our series of classical curricula, which is going to be a full course on Latin. So it's going to allow you to teach yourself Latin, work your way from zero to reading Caesar unadapted. We've actually got a classical scholar that's working on that with us, and I'm really excited about this. It's gonna be great. Yeah. And we've got another series coming out next year that's going to sort of be collating and collecting the primary sources of, shall we say, certain nationalist movements in the 20th century. And we're going to be setting those out because a lot of the sources are very disparate. You have to buy very expensive editions, and many of them to get these like people in their own words. So really, the long range future of Imperium Press is sort of building itself towards being a total educational institution and not just a dissident publisher. So that's kind of the direction we're going with it.
That's brilliant. I'm so happy to hear all that. Really lifts my heart up a lot. There's a gentleman that I interviewed some time ago who already has a curriculum program going. It's for homeschooling, so it's for younger kids, different grades. But I think I'm going to have to get you guys connected for sure.
Is that Inoue Enchiridion?
I can't know. I'm sorry. I'll have to look back in my episodes and find him. But I'll get you connected though.
Yeah, that would be great.
Yeah, for sure. So thank you so much for joining us, and thank you again.
Thank you.
Yeah, indeed, and also for Nullus's contribution as well. Extremely rich discussion, extremely important, and so you've really done a great deal to contribute to the Imperium Art project. Thank you.
Well, thanks for having us on, and I'm really happy that the Imperium Art and Imperium Press Imperium gang can finally get into the same room together.
Well, we're going to start our own band now, I guess. All right. Well, thank you so much to the audience for joining us. And please do leave your comments below, subscribe, share, and have yourself a wonderful day.